Hi, I'm Janice Switlo. There's a lot of discussion about Prime Minister Justin Trudeau campaigning for a seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. In fact, he had to cancel one of his campaign trips to actually make it back to Canada, to deal with a situation pertaining to railway blockades and interferences and such, based on support for the matters that have been going on in Wet'suwet'en Nation. So a lot of people are like, why is it so important that he wants to have a seat on the Security Council? Well, first of all, it's important to know that the five original the permanent members of the Security Council, that's Britain, USA, USSR, France, and China, the original. They have this veto power, and then there are additional member UN nations appointed or elected for certain limited periods of time, usually 2-year periods. Well, the Security Council, why is this key, and why is Justin Trudeau interested in influencing the decisions of the Security Council? Well, under Article 39 of the UN Charter, the Security Council determines any threat to the peace. Now, coincidentally, what I have been documenting and informing the Queen about the last 2 years or so, even longer I think now, are the numerous actions that have been taken by this Canadian government, previous government, just re-elected minority, but I'm speaking now, most of this happened with the majority Liberal Party in control of Canada. And I specifically warned how certain actions, and I've documented this, are actually threats to the peace. Well, what that then suggests is that I'm paper trailing, gathering evidence, and preparing to make a statement to such effect that there is indeed a threat to the peace. And that would then be something that the Security Council may need to consider. I don't tend to rely on the UN for any strategic positioning, but the fact remains that that is their area of responsibility to other UN member nations. Then these threats, I didn't use this lightly, threat to the peace. And I'm not going to get into the documents that have been provided and the evidence trail I have created while Canada has been busy trying to paper trail that, well, this is what Indigenous nationals want. They want to come under Canada, and this is all great, and we're just going to make it happen by passing laws. The Prime Minister at that point had to pull back on some laws that he wanted to have in place and continue this approach in a less obvious way. But bottom line, when you undermine the foundations of Canada, which is based on treaty, which is where the Crown gets her permissions from, and you start to act as if that's not true, and you start to manufacture consent and act as if, for instance, Indian Act Chief and Council hold the power when they don't, then yeah, you are threatening the peace, because the peace exists. Because instead of the Crown, instead of Britain coming over here and saying, we're going to engage in war and try to conquer these people, they built a relationship that's premised on commercial relations. And there's so many episodes that I need to do for you to talk about things like NRTA and Rupert's Land and things like that. Those will come later. Because the permissions that she granted to her people and the companies that came over were to engage in trade. There was the fact of that trade and commerce taking place did not confer any conquering of nations or any taking of title. Her permissions for exercising partial political sovereignty in this part of the world comes strictly from the treaties. Canada wants to ignore those treaties, call them historic, call them sui generis domestic agreements, reframe them, recharacterize them, get Indigenous nationals to start repeating that kind of language so they can be shown to have agreed. 20 years from now, 40 years from now, Canada can bring up all the agreements, can bring up all the court cases and say, at some point in the 21st century, if not the 20th century, they were gone. They abandoned it. In fact, the recent add to that is, in 1982, when the Constitution Act 1982 was passed, somehow Indigenous law was subsumed into and under Canadian law. None of those things work. All of those things, instead of proceeding with the arrangement in place that sets a peaceful foundation that Canada is bound by. Remember, I call Canada an outlaw nation because it fails to build upon those foundations that are put in place. Instead wants something different. Well, that threatens the peace. We're seeing it, aren't we? We're seeing it in the actions taking place. Now, those people who are out there on blocking trains and roads and intersections may not have the level of knowledge, for instance, that I do and can convey the details of it, but they're reacting, and this is not their. They didn't initiate it. They're reacting to how Canada is reacting to Indigenous nations. So the plan, the foundation, as I said, is there. We're not needing to recreate that. Jody Wilson-Raybould likes to say, well, you got to let these people rebuild within Canada. No, it's not necessary. That's just another one of these losing solutions that keep being proposed by people saying the only way we can do that is somehow shove these people within Canadian Confederation. That's not how it started out. That is not what exists. It's totally a waste of time to trot out the same people promoting the same resolutions that are only getting us to an escalated stage. And that's all I have to say.